I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 74 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, May 30th, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss its study of the role of McKinsey & Company in the creation and the beginnings of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted on Thursday, February 3rd, 2022, its study on the large port infrastructure expansion projects in Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. Members can attend in person or in the room or remotely using Zoom.
Inform members before we begin that all of the witnesses appearing before us today have been sound tested and have passed the test for the benefit of our interpreters. With us today, as an individual appearing for the first hour, is the Honourable Bill Morneau, PC, former Minister of Finance by video conference. I'd like to welcome you to our committee today, Mr. Morneau, and thank you very much for your time. In the second hour, we will be discussing and going through the clause by clause in camera of our study on Grand Port expansion projects in Canada. We will begin right away to ensure that we don't lose any time with our line of questioning, and for that, I will turn the floor over to you, Dr. Lewis, to get things started. Beforehand, actually, do we have opening remarks by Mr. Morneau? No, we do not. So, Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Morneau, for coming. It's nice to see you here, and I'm glad that your headset is working today. Now, Canadians are told that this Canada Infrastructure Bank is independent and arm's length from the government, but right from the very beginning, it seems that government was quite hands-on in directing the bank's management and investment decisions. We heard from Mr. Sabia, who testified before this committee on Tuesday, May 16, 2023, and he stated that after you appointed him as board chair in April 2020, you asked him to seek out outside advisors for the infrastructure bank. And I quote Mr. Sabia. He asked, referring to you, Mr. Morneau, whether in working with the management of the bank and outside advisors, we could accelerate the activity of the bank and what was called at the time the growth plan for the bank. Yes, you are correct that in order to do that in the quickest and most economical way, decisions taken at the time was to use some of the people from McKinsey who had been involved in the initial thinking around the infrastructure bank to draw on their accumulated knowledge of this so that we wouldn't have to start from ground zero and we would be able to move quickly. So at that time, you, a Liberal minister, steered the infrastructure bank to give a sole source contract to high-price McKinsey consultants. Would you agree that this is inappropriate for you as a minister of the government to instruct the Crown Corporation about hiring outside consultants?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back and have the opportunity to speak to this committee. I appreciate the work that you're doing, the work in particular around looking at how we can have investment in infrastructure, which I think is very important. I want to make sure I can be heard appropriately. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well, Mr. Morneau.
Okay, thank you. I want to say from day one, it was important from the government's perspective in setting up the Canada Infrastructure Bank that we set up something that was independent from government. The idea behind the institution was that it could accelerate investment in infrastructure in Canada. And our conclusion was that a Crown Corporation separate from management by government would be the best way for us to do that. So that was the conclusion reached early on. And certainly that was the way that we saw the Canada Infrastructure Bank during my entire time in office.
Thank you for your background information, but my question was directed at whether or not you instructed Mr. Sabia to hire outside consultants. That was his testimony. Is that correct? Did you instruct him to do that?
No, at no time was I involved in the management or the direction of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. That would be separate from the role of Minister of Finance. So I had no involvement at any time in discussions on who would or would not be used to help the infrastructure bank to achieve its goals.
Thank you for that answer. And I also understand that you had a meeting between there was a meeting between the Prime Minister, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, and Dominic Barton that was announced, and Dominic Barton became the chair of your advisory council, and that advisory council helped conceptualize the infrastructure bank. Is that correct?
The conception of the Canada Infrastructure Bank really came over a long period of time. We had it in our election campaign platform in 2015. My background in this area goes back, though, much further. Back in 2012, I was asked by the Ontario government to help set up a new independent pension organization, consolidating smaller pension funds so that we could have the potential for those funds to invest more in infrastructure. So I have a long history in looking at how investment in infrastructure can be increased. And that was one of the reasons why we came to the table in the 2015 election with the idea of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which was, of course, then subsequently considered and eventually implemented. But it was a long time in development.
Dominic Barton, how well did you know him before you appointed him chair?
I didn't know Dominic. I certainly knew of Dominic's strong reputation as one of Canada's leading international business people. I had pretty limited exposure to him prior to my time in office. I can't remember if I'd ever actually met him, but certainly was delighted that he was willing to come on board and be part of our advisory council.
Did you have any role in getting Canada Infrastructure Bank to award the first project investment to Mr. Sabia's pension fund, Le Classe du Dépôt du Placement Québec, largest pensions fund?
No.
The Infrastructure Bank was set up by an act of Parliament in June 2017. Usually a Crown Corporation is set up by an act of Parliament and draws on the capability of the public service. Why did you not draw on that capability of the public service?
I'm sorry, I don't have an appreciation for exactly how that process worked. What I can say is that we went through a process of deliberation on how best we could set up the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and then went through the normal procedures for doing that, including considering the budgetary issues and the implementation.
I was a McKinsey-led economic advisory council chosen over our qualified public service.
In fact, one of the things that I thought was important when we came into office was to make sure that we had advice from all sectors of the economy as we considered our economic plans. So the idea behind the Advisory Council on Growth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morneau. We'll go on to our next member, and that will be Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes for your question, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and good to see you, Mr. Morneau. We are, of course, discussing the Infrastructure Bank today, and I want to make a few comments about that first, and then I'll turn it over to you for a couple of questions. During Mr. Aaron Corey's testimony last month, he said that the CIB looks to invest in projects that have become stuck and to encourage private partnerships investments by reducing market risk. So looking at CIB's broadband investments, for example, Mr. Corey stated that if the CIB were to be abolished, those projected broadband connections would be abandoned. The CIB is helping to fill the gaps that for-profit companies, I guess you'd call them, not found a business case to provide service for. So when you look at, for example, the broadband work that's going on across the country, and our government is committed to connecting all Canadians to the internet and to give them an opportunity, no matter where they live, to be able to use the broadband and the internet services of providers. which would never happen without investments from our government. I mean, it's very clear that Bell and Rogers and Eastlink and others in rural Newfoundland and Labrador had eliminated or omitted providing services to many small communities in my riding of Bonavista, Beer and Trinity, and other places in Labrador, Northern Labrador, and across the country. Rural communities were being left out of the loop. I think it was really highlighted during the COVID period why it was so critically important that we do what we're doing, and that is for children in schools who spent time on the systems trying to learn while everybody was being shuttered during COVID. It was important for the medical field, where doctors and connectivity was critically important to still deal with the people they were treating, their patients. So rural Canada is, benefiting immensely from our investment in the internet services across the country. So I want to ask you, based on that, and based on, for example, continuous upgrades that are happening now because of our investment, like fiber op in communities like Grand Bank, at the tip of the Burin Peninsula, and Marystown, and others. I want to ask you, why do you think this is important for Canadians socially and economically?
Before you respond, Mr. Morneau, I just want to inform Mr. Iachino. Oh, okay, you muted your microphone. Mr. Morneau, please respond.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question and the background. I certainly share your views that it's critically important for us to think about different ways that we can encourage the investments that we need across Canada. And the Canada Infrastructure Bank was charged really as one of the institutions that could help to encourage private investment that's more significant. On the specific issue around ensuring that we have the appropriate broadband coverage across our country, we obviously have a country that's got high levels of density and places where there's very low levels of density in terms of people, which makes it challenging for telecommunications companies to make the investment required in the places that are hard to get at. So it's the exact kind of application that we thought of when we thought about the Canada Infrastructure Bank. How can we find a way to ensure that private investments will come in places that are important for Canadians and do that in a way that has a positive economic outcome, but also, as you say, a positive social outcome. So I'm encouraged to see that sort of work is happening. I think that the Infrastructure Bank, as you mentioned in your comments, has the ability to create financial instruments that make it more possible to make those kind of investments. And we would certainly be less well off, both socially and economically, if those investments don't happen.
Okay, and I'd like for you to, just a minute or so left, tell the committee why you feel it's important for all political parties and all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, to support getting infrastructure projects built for Canadians.
Thank you. And that was really the backdrop to the discussion that we had both prior to getting into government in 2015 and in the early days as we considered the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We recognize that with a growing population, with the importance of ensuring that we have the capacity to continue to live a prosperous life with strong infrastructure, we were going to need to escalate the amount of investment in infrastructure. We knew that putting in place a Canada Infrastructure Bank wouldn't crowd out private investment. In fact, it would crowd in private investment, so increase the amount of investment. We saw the possibility of getting $5 of private investment for every dollar of investment from Canada Infrastructure Bank. And moreover, investment in infrastructure has a positive, what they call multiplier effect on the growth in the Canadian economy. So we saw that as a win-win-win, a win for Canadians with better infrastructure, a win for the investors, and of course, a win for the economy with the growth that comes out of those investments. So a very positive outcome in all regards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers, and thank you, Mr. Morneau. Next, prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelot Duval.
Next, we have Mr. Barcelot Duval. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Morneau for being with us this morning. Last time, of course, you were here, but you were unable to testify, to my great regret, and I think to the regret of all of the committee members. I don't have a lot of time, so I'd like to start straight off with questions. The first question has to do with Michael Sabia. In his testimony, Michael Sabia said that when he was asked to be part of the advisory committee, the Growth Council, you were the one who had asked him to join it. Is that correct?
Merci pour votre.
Thank you for the question.
Certainly happy to be here with the committee this morning, and pleased to take your questions. I can't say that I recall specifically a conversation with Michael Sabia, but I do know that I held Michael Sabia in high regard, would have been supportive of him joining the advisory council because of the expertise that he brought to the table as a former public servant, as someone who'd been a CEO. So yes, I would have been very supportive of that and likely made that phone call.
Merci. Monsieur Sabia.
Thank you. Mr. Sabia also said in his testimony that you were the one who had recruited him so that he could take the lead of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Is that also correct?
At the time period that we asked Mr. Sabia to be the chair of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, I do believe that I would have been the one who would have spoken to him about that possibility. So I can't recall the exact conversation, but I imagine that would have been one that we would have had.
I asked that question because, at the time it actually surprised me. I understand that you would have met with him about the Growth Council, and then you would have said, okay, you have a certain expertise, I've liked your work, and so on. I can imagine the types of conversations that happened. You probably said, well, if you're no longer at the Caisse de dépôt, it would be interesting to have you at the Infrastructure Bank. But the thing is that the Infrastructure Bank actually fell under the Department of Infrastructure and not the Department of Finance. So why did the Department of Finance recruit Michael Sabia for the Infrastructure Bank?
I believe that, from the very beginning of the discussions around the Canada Infrastructure Bank, that there was a joint responsibility between the Infrastructure Department and the Finance Department. There was certainly at most periods during that time period a lead taken by the Minister of Infrastructure, and that was the way that the responsibilities were handled. But at all times during the period in which I was in office, there was a joint set of responsibility for that institution. I would have been the person that would have had experience with Mr. Sabia, knowing his business reputation from before my time in office, the exposure working with him at the advisory council, and would have likely had that conversation because of that background.
Vous avez dit un peu plus tôt, puis c'est ce qu'il y a aussi.
Earlier you said, and this is something that Ms. McKenna also said, she said that this is sort of arm's length from the government. But at the same time, Mr. Sabia seemed to be very popular with your government. He was part of the Growth Council. He was recruited for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. He was also recruited as Deputy Minister of Finance a few months later. So are you certain that the Infrastructure Bank was really arm's length, really independent from the government? And also, what explains Mr. Sabia's incredible popularity with your government?
Perhaps I can step back to properly answer that question. We looked at the Canada Infrastructure Bank as being independent from government as a key feature of the bank. We saw that it was important, given the mandate to be able to invest in infrastructure, that it be separate from government in order to develop the kinds of projects that would be required. They would need to work together with different levels of government, and having a level of independence would have been critically important. So that was our decision from the very beginning.
Pourquoi est-ce que Monsieur Sabia?
But why was Mr. Sabia so popular, among your party, your former government?
The decision around putting Mr. Sabia on as one of the members of the advisory council was consistent with our broader view. We wanted to seek people with different levels of expertise. We sought people with climate expertise, people with significant international business expertise, Indigenous expertise, and Mr. Sabia brought with him an understanding of infrastructure investment. He brought with him an understanding of the federal government. He brought with him an understanding of a large Canadian corporation. So he had multiple areas of expertise that I sought out as being particularly helpful in the advisory council. And
question pour vous, c'est de savoir, est-ce que
So, I'm wondering, with a Crown Corporation, is it normal to have a minister personally intervene to try to recruit someone who's going to become the head of a Crown Corporation? I mean, normally I would think there would be some sort of public competition or maybe there would be headhunters involved. But how is it that the Minister of Finance would be doing that work personally? 15 seconds, please.
Thank you. I do believe there is an important and robust process that is put in place for seeking the leaders of institutions. For the all of the leadership roles, that would have been the way that it was done. However, there's also an element of trying to convince people that they should be part of this, and that was something that I leaned into in the case of the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morneau. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Barce-Duval. Next, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Morneau, for being with us today. Mr. Morneau, is it fair to say that the goal of the advisory council that you established was to advise the government on the design and structure and strategy behind the Canada Infrastructure Bank?
No. The advisory council, we were looking to for advice, ideas on long-term economic policies that could advantage Canada. It was intended to be a group that could bring an outside perspective, work together with us to develop those ideas. And then, of course, we would have the opportunity to consider their advice or not as we move forward with our public policy decisions. But it was really very much that. How do we develop long-term economic policy that will raise our prospects for prosperity for Canadians?
Mr. Morneau, was part of the advisory council's advice to government that it should establish a standalone arm's-length bank-type organization that would facilitate private investment in infrastructure projects? Is that something they recommended?
The platform that we came in on 2015 had already identified the Canada Infrastructure Bank framework as something that we thought would have a positive economic impact on the country. So one of the things that the Advisory Council did was look at that platform commitment and consider how best we might be able to activate that. And that was information that we took as we thought about how we could move forward on that platform commitment and ended up with the Canada Infrastructure Bank as you see it.
So the Advisory Council provided advice to government on how best to activate the platform that the government had already decided was going to be a good platform to further the infrastructure goals.
Stepping back, I think what we talked about in 2015 was how important it was to not only continue, but to increase our investments in infrastructure. We saw multiple ways to do that. One way that we wanted to do that was by setting up a structure that would allow us to bring in outside investment into Canadian infrastructure. We saw Canadian pension funds.
You're going back to the original point, but I just wanted to confirm that the bank actually, what you said earlier was that the Advisory Council provided government with advice on how to activate the platform being the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So that's what you said. I'd like to move on to another theme. On May 2016, or on May 16th, 2016, you were at a meeting at Meech Lake with the new Advisory Council. This is a meeting that I assume Mr. Sabia and the other Advisory Council members would have been at. I'm looking at an article here from 2017 that focuses on the concept of conflict of interest. And what it outlines is that the members of the Advisory Council were asked, I assume prior to that first meeting at Meech Lake, to sign a document that pledged to act only in the public, in which they pledged to act only in the public interest. And the document stated, quote, while recognizing the likelihood that a member of the council, a company or institution that a member is associated with may benefit from the decisions made by the government based on advice from the council, and that members may be associated with companies that do business with the government, members are reminded that they should avoid any real, apparent, or perceived conflict of interest. Mr. Morneau, could you give me an example of what an apparent or perceived conflict of interest could be in this context? What was envisioned by that document? What kind of situation was envisioned?
Well, I'm pleased to hear that that process was followed. I can tell you that I would not have been involved in the process around ensuring that all advisory council members would have been clear that they needed to avoid conflicts of interest. But I would have known that they would need to make that commitment.
Could you give me an example of what an apparent or perceived conflict of interest in this context would be?
I, again, wasn't involved in setting up those conflict of interest declarations.
Mr. Morneau, do you know what a conflict of interest is, either apparent or perceived? Are you familiar with the concept? I'm sure you've signed these documents yourself before.
I, again, didn't have any involvement with that particular document, so can't really make a comment on something that I haven't seen. But of course,
a question about the document. It was a question about the concept, Mr. Morneau. There's a legal concept, apparent and perceived conflict of interest. Are you familiar with the concept?
Again, of course, I've personally been involved in signing off on documents, but I didn't see this document.
That wasn't the question either. The question was, are you familiar with the concept of perceived or apparent conflict of interest, the legal concept?
Yes, of course, I've had exposure to these concepts in the past, but I've, again, not had anything to do with this part of the development of the advisory council or the membership.
And you can't describe for the committee what kind of situation might arise, might bring up such a conflict in the context of the advisory council. You can't, like it's right in the document. They talk about people who are both involved in designing and setting the table and then sitting down and eating at the table, that would be an apparent or perceived conflict of interest. I think that really gets to the nub of what some of the concerns are in the context of this hearing, which is that you have the same individuals involved in the advisory council providing the government with advice on how to, in your words, activate the platform of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. They then just move over 2 seats at the table, sit down, and eat from the menu that they themselves set. That's the problem here, Mr. Morneau. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach, and thank you, Mr. Morneau. Next, we have Dr. Lewis once again. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Morneau, given that the advisory council was led by Dominic Barton and supported by McKinsey and Company, did you see a perceived conflict of interest in that McKinsey was right away awarded consulting contracts in the amount of $1.6 million by the bank, and that these contracts were not advertised and they were sole sourced contracts? Do you see a perceived conflict in that?
Thank you for the question. I was pleased, as I mentioned earlier, to have Dominic Barton take the role of chair of my advisory council. And the fact that he did that on a pro bono basis was important. And I saw that as a good contribution to what we were trying to achieve. I had no exposure following that to any decisions that the Canada Infrastructure Bank took on how they were going to determine the best way to execute on their mission. So I have no knowledge of any contract that you're speaking of, so really have no way to respond.
Right, but Mr. Bachrach was asking you about whether or not you had any understanding of the legal concept of a perceived conflict. And I'm asking you that someone who you said acted out of altruism and worked for free on an advisory council, and then their company was awarded $1.6 million in a contract that was not advertised and that was a sole source contract. Does that jive with your concept, your legal concept that you said that you have an understanding of a perceived conflict?
Again, I have no way of answering that question. I have no knowledge about any contract that was or wasn't reported. I have no understanding of any process that that might have taken place. So I have just no way of responding other than to say that during the period in which I was engaged in working on the advisory council, we sought out people that could help us with our thinking about long-term economic prosperity and developed ideas that we then had as part of our decision-making framework as we considered our plans. Some of those decisions and those discussions were helpful and some weren't.
Okay, by point of
and,
clarification,
it was
so are you
helpful.
telling me that you were not aware that McKinsey was later awarded or benefited from obtaining a sole source contract from the Canada Infrastructure Bank during your tenure? You weren't aware of that?
I was at no time aware of that, had no knowledge prior to any of these committee meetings.
Okay, so as a part of the pitch to the CIB's executive, McKinsey actually referenced their deep understanding of the bank and surrounding context, which they gained from the Economic Advisory Council. And it seems obvious to me that as minister or as government that you would have made some effort to ensure that consultants that the consultant clients are not inappropriately benefiting from inside knowledge. Is this in this study, we also confirmed that many McKinsey clients are currently or have been currently clients of the bank. Were you ever concerned that McKinsey might be benefiting in any way from the work that it did in the Economic Advisory Council?
I was at no time involved in any meetings with McKinsey about work they might have been part of for the government. So I have no exposure to any of that work. I had no concerns at working on the advisory council. It was an effective council that helped us with thinking about long-term economic decisions. But again, had no meetings during my entire time as Minister of Finance with McKinsey.
Were the minister in charge of creating the bank, and so wouldn't it be normal for you to put in place some due diligence to ensure that it's a company that predominantly was working on the advisory council did not then inappropriately benefit from their deep knowledge of the bank?
As I mentioned earlier, one of our key goals with the setup of the Canada Infrastructure Bank was to make sure that they were able to operate independently of government. We saw that as an advantage. Of course, there would have been a significant deliberations on the right processes to put in place in that institution. I know that the public service, the Department of Infrastructure, the Department of Finance would have worked on making sure those processes were put in place. And then, of course, it would have been up to the Canada Infrastructure Bank itself to follow those processes that had been agreed to at the outset. I was not involved.
Thank you
Were
very
you
much,
aware?
Dr. Lewis. Unfortunately, there's no time left. Thank you, Mr. Morneau. Next, we have Ms. O'Connell. Ms. O'Connell, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Morneau. It's good to see you again. We've done this a lot at committee together over the years. I wanted to start with that last question in terms of the perceived conflict for a sole source. It was unfortunately a trick question for you because we heard testimony that there was no sole source contracts to McKinsey. In fact, there were 3 firms that were considered. So it would be actually impossible for you to make a determination on whether something was a conflict of interest based on a sole source contract that was in fact not sole sourced. And in fact had a whole internal process on how to issue contracts that had a minimum of looking at three potential bidders. And in this case, one was deemed to not be able to provide the work, but there were still 2 that moved forward. So just wanted you to know that the question presented to you was in fact a trick. But when you don't have facts on your side, you have to resort to misinformation, I guess. But Mr. Morneau, I'd like to talk to you about, it's hard to be anywhere in this country right now and not think about climate change, the forest fires that Canada is burning, and the impact on our country in dealing with that. And one of the things that I know was important to you and certainly important to our government was dealing with climate change. And we've heard testimony in other studies about we need every tool in the toolbox to deal with climate change and climate change adaptation. Was dealing with climate change, reducing emissions, and doing so with industry partners a factor in why the Canada Infrastructure Bank was something that not only you testified here today was something you had been looking at, but something that was important in terms of the government's overall climate action?
Well, thank you, and it is nice to be back in at least a virtual meeting with you after a few years. One of the things that we saw as critically important with the Canada Infrastructure Bank was the need for us to rethink infrastructure in ways that were going to be resilient against climate change. So we do need to think about policies that are going to reduce our carbon emissions. We also need to think about how we both adapt and mitigate the challenges that we are facing up to. And that, in many cases, will require significant investment. We knew that the government couldn't make all those investments itself, that we're going to need to crowd in private sector investment in order to have the kinds of investments that will be there for the long term. Investments that range from, the kinds of roads we'll have with the kinds of charging stations that we'll need to our electricity grids and the way that we're going to be able to get energy around our country. So those kinds of investments were on our mind, certainly as one of the potential advantages in the Canada Infrastructure Bank crowding in private sector investment, making it good for the economy, but also good for our ability to deal with climate change.
Thank you for that. I also there has been testimony during this study of, what existed previously was P3 Canada, and there was suggestion, why not just keep going with that? Why create the Canada Infrastructure Bank at all? And I would just like to get your thoughts, since you led this creation and recommended it, but P3 Canada had, in I think over 10 years, or around 10 years, had 25 projects and only $1.3 billion worth of investment. Meanwhile, Canada Infrastructure Bank, in its inception to date, which has existed a lot in less time than P3 Canada, the Canada Infrastructure Bank currently has 46 projects and has leveraged $35 billion worth of investment. Did you think about continuing P3 Canada? If so, why did you choose to move with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which seems to be the better decision? But what was your thinking at the time?
Our thinking at the time was that we needed to consider the best ways to ensure that we were going to be able to significantly enhance our investment in infrastructure in the country. We wanted to find a way to make sure that large sources of capital would come into Canadian infrastructure. We were looking at the Canadian pension funds as an example that are investors in infrastructure around the world, and wanted to find a way to make sure that they would have the opportunity to make those similar investments in Canada. So it was really very much about, it wasn't criticizing what had come in the past, it was ramping up so that we could be much more impactful in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morneau, and thanks, Ms. O'Connell. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Next, we have Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to go back a little bit. Dominic Barton was working pro bono for you on the Growth Council. That's what you said, Mr. Morneau. And Michael Sabia also did pro bono work on the same Growth Council. That's the council that then provided advice about how the Canada Infrastructure Bank should be working in the future. And I find that interesting because Mr. Barton and McKinsey then got over $1 million in contracts from the Infrastructure Bank just after hiring Michael Sabia as the head, who was also doing pro bono work, and Michael Sabia being the person that you yourself recruited. So I think you can understand how This seems like a little bit suspicious. You know, my colleague talked about people sitting at the table and eating at the same table. Does this not appear like a conflict of interest to you?
It was, from my perspective, important that we sought out people for my advisory council on growth that would be able to bring a perspective to the table. And that included people like Dominic Barton and Michael Sabia. It included others that had significant expertise in other domains, both across Canada.
Monsieur Morneau, ce que je vous parle.
Mr. Morneau, I'm talking about people who were doing pro bono work for your growth council who then financially benefited from the infrastructure bank. That's what I'm talking about. Do you not find that strange? Do you not think that there's at least an appearance of conflict of interest?
I had no exposure to any of the decisions that the Canada Infrastructure Bank took on how it would best meet its goals. Whether it did that internally or whether it did that with advisors was something that was not ever brought to me, nor did I have an opinion on it at the time.
OK, j'ai une dernière question.
Okay, I have a last question for you. We talked about the independence of the bank, but going back in time a little bit, the REM project in Quebec, you know, the government had announced funding for that before the infrastructure bank was set up. Then once the infrastructure bank was set up, that subsidy turned into a loan. And when I asked Mr. Sabia why that happened, he said it was a political decision. So were infrastructure bank decisions really being made independently, or were there also political considerations being dictated by the government? 10 seconds, please.
I'm not aware of how those two decisions were taken, other than to say that we would see a project like the REM project as being a positive infrastructure project for the country, and so that would have made it a good candidate for the Canada Infrastructure Bank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morneau. Merci, Mr. Barcel-Duval. Next, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Morneau, at the meeting at Meech Lake in May of 2016, there was a memo that essentially showed that members of the council were told that their mandate included coming up with, quote, bold ideas and policy approaches that are not bound by operational or political constraints and develop recommendations to inform Budget 2017. What would you describe as being political constraints?
I was seeking with the advisory council to get expertise from people that weren't in politics, that weren't necessarily in government, but that would bring us the kind of ideas that could help us to change a trajectory of growth that we saw as problematic. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't have any exclusions in terms of ideas. Of course, because the advisory council came up with ideas and worked on things that they thought could have an impact, didn't mean that we necessarily would implement them. But we thought that that thinking would be important for us in trying to create a better outcome for Canadians.
An article here, Mr. Morneau, that says the headline is Morneau says new infrastructure bank to shield taxpayers from project risks. I assume those risks include things like cost overruns. Is that correct?
The idea behind the bank, and I can't comment on that particular article, not having seen it, but the idea behind
the question was, do those risks include things like cost overruns? Is that the kind of risk that you were trying to shield taxpayers from?
Again, I haven't seen the article, but the idea from the bank is to crowd in other sources of capital, which would, of course, reduce the amount of money that the government is spending on a project and increase the amount that the private sector is spending. So by definition, there would be a risk.
I understand the reasoning behind the bank. The question was, do the risks you were trying to shield the taxpayers from include cost overruns?
Again, the risks of the projects would have been less for the government if there were other investors involved.
Risks include cost overruns? Is that an example of the risks you were trying to shield taxpayers from?
Broadly speaking, the way that we were looking at the infrastructure bank was to crowd more money into infrastructure.
I'm just absolutely stupefied by the lack of a response here. It's like, it's a pretty straight up question. Do the risks that you're trying to shield taxpayers from using the Canada Infrastructure Bank include cost overruns?
10-second response, please, Mr. Morneau.
Well, I thank you for your question, and unfortunately, I haven't seen the article, but I've been clear into what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Mr. Morneau, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Jennis. Mr. Jennis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. Mr. Morneau, thank you for being here. I do want to recognize your significant experience in both the public and the private sector. And in order to help set the context, I want to ask you a couple questions about the budget. What letter grade would you give the latest federal budget?
I have not taken the time to go through the budget line by line. Certainly, during my time in office, among the things that we did that I think were important included the Canada Infrastructure Bank as important.
Chair, just to follow up on that, though. I mean, I'm not asking you to sort of quote chapter and verse, but overall, in terms of your impression of the budget, is it an A budget, a B budget, a C budget, a D budget? What do you think?
As you can imagine, I took some time to prepare for this committee meeting this morning and made sure that I reviewed the Canada Infrastructure Bank. But among the things I reviewed, it did not include the budget for this year.
Okay. I'm trying to set the context here, but in terms of this whole area, do you agree that government spending is driving up inflation?
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chahal.
This is out of order. Mr. Morneau is not here to answer questions on the budget. He's here to answer questions on McKinsey and CIB, as that's what our study's about.
Mr. Chair, if I can just comment on the point of order. First of all, it's interesting that Liberal members don't want to hear this, but Ms. O'Connell asked extensive questions about the current wildfires and climate change, and Mr. Chahal didn't object at that time. I think if Ms. O'Connell's questions were allowed to stand and considered relevant in the context of the current study, then mine are certainly more relevant since they actually deal with financial matters and government spending. And these things can be interpreted different ways, but I hope you would apply the rules equally to members in different parties.
Thank you, Mr. Jennis. I believe Ms. O'Connell's remarks were her prelude to her questions. Her questions weren't actually in regards to that. She made them very specific to the relationship and the infrastructure bank. So I'd kindly ask that you and all members keep her questioning to the relationship regarding McKinsey and Company and the infrastructure bank. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair. I will make the link and appreciate the opportunity. Just given the question was asked, if he agrees that government spending is driving inflation, if Mr. Morneau, just give him a chance to respond if he wants to. Go ahead, Mr. Morneau.
One of the ideas behind the Canada Infrastructure Bank was that we would make investments that would be effective for the long term and that would not crowd out private sector investment. So it was not seen from our perspective as something that was going to be inflationary, something that would be positive for the long-term prosperity of Canada. But in no way did we see it as a mechanism that would be anything other than finding a way to increase investment in a needed area. So, that's the closest link to inflation to the subject this morning.
Right. Okay. Maybe just to follow up on that then, is there a point at which spending on the infrastructure bank in combination with spending overall government, do you think at a certain point government spending is inflationary in its effects?
Sorry, Mr. Jennis, I'm going to ask you to make a link between that question and the study that this committee is embarking on, please.
Yeah, I did. I just said in the context of spending on the infrastructure bank and spending in general, the government has to make decisions about spending on the infrastructure bank as well as other areas. And so I think whether spending is inflationary or not is linked to that.
But the question at hand, Mr. Jennis, is what role did McKinsey and Company play in the creation of the infrastructure bank? I don't see the relevance, and I'm going to ask you please to make a relevant case as to why that question is linked.
Because the question of whether this was a good policy or not is informed by the question of what its effects are. You allow Liberal members to speak at length about climate change in the context of their questions, and I think Canadians want to hear from Mr. Morneau on these questions. And I think it's as or more relevant as Ms. O'Connell's questions. So, and I referenced the infrastructure bank in my explanation. How much time do I have left, by the way, Chair?
You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds because I took away the time of the point of order.
Thank you very much. Okay. I have other things I want to ask about, but Mr. Morneau, do you want to respond to this point?
I have nothing to respond to that particular point.
Okay. In terms of the management of the infrastructure bank today and the current situation of its activities, are there things you would be doing differently if you were still the finance minister today?
I'm not closely linked to the Canada Infrastructure Bank today, so don't really have any way to comment on their current management or governance. When I was Minister of Finance, would have been engaged only from a distance because it was a separate institution. So really can't answer that question with any seriousness.
Okay. Do you think that the interest rate hikes we're seeing now were a predictable result of current government policy?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Once again, no relevancy to the study. The member
Let him answer.
would know from committee members who brought this motion forward that we're here to study McKinsey and the Infrastructure Bank, not interest rates, not finance policy from another committee. So I would ask the member to focus on what we're here to study. And if
I didn't
members
interrupt
across
Ms.
want a
O'Connell
different
at
study
all.
on finance, they should bring that forward. But we've agreed upon a study on McKinsey and the Infrastructure Bank. Mr. Morneau's taken his time out of his schedule to come here to answer questions on that, so we should focus on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chahal. I'll once again ask that we ensure that our questions are relevant to the question of the role that McKinsey and Company played in the creation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And once again, your time has been stopped as to not penalize you for the point of orders, Mr. Janice.
Thank you, Chair. I let Ms. O'Connell go far afield of the topic without interruption, and it's interesting that Liberal members don't want to hear from the former Liberal finance minister about these issues. Do you want to answer the question I just asked, Mr. Morneau, and then I'm going to ask you about Mr. Pickersgill in the time I have left.
I'm happy for you to move on to other questions.
But do you want to address the issue of were the interest rate hikes the predictable result of current government policy? Would you like to address that?
In fact, when I was Minister of Finance, I made it my absolute priority not to comment on interest rates, and I think I'll continue that this morning.
What interactions did you have with Mr. Pickersgill in the context of your role as Minister of Finance in general? What interactions did you have with Mr. Pickersgill?
I don't believe I've ever in my life had a meeting one-on-one with Mr. Pickersgill. I think that he was one of the people that was supporting Dominic Barton at a certain stage in the Advisory Council deliberations.
Did you meet with your staff at any point?
I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Was he the one responsible for selling McKinsey products and services to the Government of Canada?
I had no exposure at all to any meetings, any commercial meetings with McKinsey during my entire time in office. So my only limited exposure would have been the work with the Advisory Council, and there was no commercial aspect to that interaction.
No, but those interactions brought Mr. Pickersgill into situations where he would have had access to senior officials and to political staff. And you're telling us that you were disinterested in the question of how he ultimately used those contacts to hawk McKinsey's products and services.
15-second response, please, Mr. Morneau.
I had no exposure whatsoever with him or with McKinsey in any commercial way, so I have no way to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morneau, and thank you, Mr. Janice. And finally, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good day, Mr. Morneau. It's good to see you again, and I want to thank you for your time today. Mr. Morneau, I'm not going to be consumed by the business of good politics, as those are within the opposition. What I'm going to focus on is the business of good government and how the government can support getting infrastructure projects built for Canadians. So I look at the list of some of the projects that are underway right now, attaching to both the private sector and the public sector, communities, provinces, territories, things of that nature. And I just want to ask you, within the Infrastructure Bank, both past, existing, and I'm hoping in the future with respect to the infrastructure, leveraged funding that they're going to provide, can you comment on three topics that, again, are of interest to myself, my community, and of course, I would assume most Canadians. How, one, leverage funding accelerates infrastructure projects and adds to a disciplined structure for asset management. Two, how leverage funding eliminates the need to defer to the property taxpayers within communities, water bills, while accelerating infrastructure projects and adhering to a disciplined structure of asset management. Basically concentrating on the public sector. Now, just shifting over to the private sector, my third question is how leverage funding strengthens supply chain resiliency and creates jobs, such as the investments in Contrecoeur with the Port of Montreal project and the Algoma retrofit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that's a lot. Thank you for the questions. I think the most important response I can make to that is that we absolutely saw that the best way for us to make use of government funding was to put it in places where we could amplify that funding by bringing in other sources of capital. And that was what we were trying to do with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And obviously, by doing that, by bringing in other sources of capital, you have many of the impacts that you just asked about. You have the impact of lowering the likely costs to taxpayers because you've created a way that makes it more efficient from a capital standpoint, and by lowering the capital costs of projects, that has an impact over time on things like taxes and other charges that might come to citizens. You also do, of course, improve people's lives, whether it's supply chain resiliency, as you say, or you improve their lives through just, frankly, better infrastructure. Any of us who's facing challenges in getting around major cities knows that that's critically important. And finally, as you said, building infrastructure, it does have an impact on jobs, and it often has impacts on jobs in places where there might not be as many other projects that are impacting those jobs because it can be in places that are fairly inconvenient to get to. So we saw all those as benefits of the focus on infrastructure. Importantly, the Canada Infrastructure Bank we saw as a way to depoliticize it, to bring forth different levels of government together so that we could all work constructively on helping people for the long term. And that, I have to say that was one of my most important reasons for thinking this was a good idea. It was a way to create long-term prosperity in a political system that too often focuses on the short term. And so creating institutions like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, from that perspective, can be seen as a very good decision and a long-term positive for Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. Morneau. And just to get a bit deeper and a bit more granular with respect to the deficits and the challenges that we have with infrastructure, especially today with climate change. And, of course, not just within urban communities, but also within Indigenous communities. There's a huge gap, specifically throughout the North, in particular. And do you feel that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is an effective tool in attempting to narrow or close the gap both in urban as well as Indigenous communities?
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Jennings.
Just respectfully, I was repeatedly interrupted on alleged topicality, and Mr. Badaway's, I think, comments could be construed as being on topic, although they don't relate to McKinsey, they don't relate to the origins of the infrastructure bank, and I would just ask that the rules be enforced consistently. It's curious that the Liberal members didn't want to hear my questions or the answers about interest rate hikes or the impact of that on Canadians, but they're very comfortable with this line of questioning, which is equivalent to mine in terms of its relationship to the topic. So I hope the rules will be enforced consistently regarding Mr. Badaway's comments as well as on mine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jennings. Mr. Badaway, with the 40 seconds that you have left,
Thank you.
Would
Thank
you
you, Mr. Chief
be able to perhaps make a clearer link?
Again, sticking to the business of good government versus the politics of government. And back to Mr. Morneau. So, Mr. Morneau, as I asked with the Infrastructure Bank and, of course, the effectiveness of it, does it in fact narrow the gap and close the gap and provide leveraged funding for a lot of the funding that we otherwise wouldn't be able to access and/or would have to then defer to the property taxpayer or Canadian taxpayers in general? Does it close that gap within the infrastructure deficits that we see across the country, including Indigenous communities?
20-second response, please, Mr. Morneau.
I think the idea behind the infrastructure bank was to make sure that we crowded in capital where it would make sense. And of course, if you bring capital on projects that would otherwise have government funding, it allows you to have government funding in other places. So it may or may not have been appropriate for the infrastructure bank to be in the places that you're talking about. That's why it was independent to come to those decisions itself, together with private sector. But if it did not, there would still be more funding available because crowding in private sector investment into other infrastructure projects creates that opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Morneau.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway, and thank you, Mr. Morneau, for your testimony and for appearing for this study. That concludes this portion of the meeting. I'd ask you now to log off, Mr. Morneau, and we wish you a good afternoon. We're now going to go from public to in camera for the next part of our meeting, and for that I will suspend for 5 minutes. Merci tout le monde. Thanks, everyone.
you.